in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, The Oxford American, ESPN, USA Today, and The Nation. A former Spencer Fellow at Columbia University, Parks was most recently awarded the 2021 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award for her work Diary of a Misfit, which is the book we're going to be discussing about today. So congratulations. And Parks lives in Portland. As we were just saying, it's a time difference. So it's like a little afternoon book launch, which is kind of nice. I like that. Our other speaker is Lauren LeBlanc. She is the New York Observer's book columnist and an independent book editor. She has written for the New York Times Book Review, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, and Los Angeles Times, among others. A New Orleans native, she now lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So thank you both so much for coming, and thank you for the audience for attending. I'm gonna pass it on over to Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan, for the introductions, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Casey, thank you so much for speaking with me. Someone else who's from the South, I love this book, and I highly encourage everyone to read it. What was I going to say? So I wondered, your background is in journalism, and this is a book. This project that you undertook has taken many different forms throughout the tenure of the time that you've been working on it. Could you talk a little bit, for people who haven't read the book, about the origin of your search for Roy, and give us a sense of how this book, this project began? It was initially imagined as possibly a podcast or a documentary, but now we have it as a book. There's been points in the books where you talk about how it could have been an essay or a magazine article. Could you talk to us about that a little bit to start?
Yeah, so the origins of the story are way back in 2002. So, oh, it says I just entered. Sorry, I just got a notification that I entered the.
I don't. Yeah, I'll accept you. See what happens.
Okay, sorry. Well, we'll see who my doppelganger is. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay,
so back in just a brief introduction. Yeah, how you came.
Back in 2002, I came out as gay to my family, and it largely did not go well. My mom wrote me letters every day telling me that thinking of me made her want to throw up. And the pastor at my church went in front of the whole congregation and prayed, "Satan has taken a hold of Casey. Lord, save her and take her." And the idea was like I would ask forgiveness for being gay and then die immediately so I could go to heaven. And I went home that summer after college to northern Louisiana to essentially like try to prove that I wasn't an evil person. And everything kind of came to a head on the 4th of July. And my mom and I wound up having this big teary conversation in the bathroom. And eventually my grandmother pulled me aside and said, "I grew up across the street from a woman who lived as a man." And at this point, like, I did not know other gay people. I did not know any trans people. Even the one, I had kissed one girl, but even she and I like never used that word gay really. I had only told like 2 people that I was gay, one of whom is on the call. But so when my grandmother told me this, like, she said it without any judgment. She just was like, "Oh yeah, like my neighbor Roy, everybody loved him." And it just gave me, I think at the time, like a lot of hope that there would be a place where I could exist in this world. And at the time I was like 18, so I wanted to be a journalist, but I wasn't really a journalist. I didn't know how to be one.
And did she talk to you plainly like this? Was that a common thing with the two of you, that you could talk to her that way, that she was so?
Oh no, we did not speak at all.
Okay.
I was not close to her. She did not like me, as far as I could tell. So it really took me by surprise that she just kind of stepped in and said this. And she knew I wanted to be a journalist. So when she told me about Roy that day, she said that he had been raised by this woman named Jewel Ellis. And on Jewel Ellis's deathbed, she called my great grandma across the street and confessed that she had taken Roy when he was a little girl and that she had dressed him as a boy. And then she just, kind of died right after this confession. And so my grandmother was like, "Well, I want to know, like, who did she kidnap him from? Like, did he have a family? Did anyone ever love him? Like, what happened to him? Like, my grandmother knew him when she was a teenager, but she'd lost touch with him. And so she was like, well, you want to be a journalist. Why don't you go to my hometown and find out about him? And so at the time, when I finally like worked up the courage to go, I was working at a newspaper, but I was really obsessed with like Radio Lab and This American Life. This is like 2006, 2007. And so I really wanted to get a job at one of those places. And I honestly, like, I just didn't know how to be a news reporter at that time. And I liked talking to people, and I wanted to figure out like how to have a job that was just kind of storytelling. And so I thought, like, if I make this podcast about Roy, like, obviously This American Life is just going to want to hire me. And it didn't. So I went down one time and I tried to make this podcast and I sent it off to This American Life and I never heard anything back. And I'm sure it wasn't like that great. But after that, instead of being like daunted by my failure, my mother was like, well, F them, basically. And she was like, why don't we make a full documentary? And my mother also did not know how to make a documentary, but I knew a couple of people in Portland who did. And so I asked them to help me. And we just we started taking trips. And for probably 10, 15 years, I thought I was making this as a documentary. And we would go down a couple times a year and film people in town who knew Roy, or sometimes people who didn't know Roy but like saw him across town. And eventually I gathered like 8 terabytes of video footage, just a massive amount of video footage, but I could never figure out really how to make it. And I applied for grants and I kept getting turned down for the grants. And finally, one woman pulled me aside. She was like, I'm not going to give you the grant, but I want to tell you why. And the reason is your main character in a story like this is supposed to change over the course of the narrative arc, and your main character doesn't change because he's dead. So you need to have a different main character who's going to change. And initially I asked her, I was like, well, what about my grandma? And she said, what about you? And I was like, no, thank you. Like, I do not want to be in this. I'm a journalist. I really grew up with this like 90s idea of a journalist where you're the invisible reporter. You don't put yourself in there. You have no opinions, no thoughts, no feelings. And I'm really comfortable with that role of just being like a cardboard cutout that, records whatever's happening. And I really just rejected that idea for a long time, and consequently I couldn't figure out how to make it. I just kept going down trying to figure out. And then finally in 2017 I moved to New York for a little bit to go to grad school at Columbia. And there's a great book writing class at Columbia where you read a book every single week and then you have to write a chapter of your book every single week. And then while you're doing that, you also have to write a book proposal, which is like this 100-page document. And all of this happens in like 2 to 3 months. It's an insane class. It meets for like 9 hours on Mondays, but you really learn how to write a book in there. Like the professor brings in editors and agents and publicists, and you just kind of learn like the whole business through him. And for one of the chapter assignments, he kind of forced me to write one about myself. He was just kind of like, you have nothing to lose, like just try one. And I remember I said something about how I wasn't a part of the story. And he just said, come on, like, don't act like you don't have skin in the game. Like, you're doing this for a reason. And I just really didn't want to ever admit that I was reporting about Roy because I had a personal connection to him at all. I just thought, like, this is a good story. It has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my family. But then when I wrote that assignment and did a version that included me, like as soon as I finished it, I knew it was better than anything I had ever made. And I was a little bit like, damn it, I don't want to
you had
do
to
this,
feel like
but
throwing yourself in the deep end at that
yeah,
point.
I didn't want to do it, but I also, I have a discerning taste and I can tell what's good and what's not. And like, I knew it was better. So I kind of from there just started trying to write a book. And I guess I succeeded because it is a book. Whether or not it's a good book is up for y'all to decide. But yeah, that's the long journey from my grandmother's bathroom to this
Right.
Zoom here.
What were you reading in that class that this professor nudged you? Was there anything that you were reading that really kind of helped you unlock that? Because yeah, it's easy for me as a reader or as a critic to say there's a complete through line with this idea about queer visibility in the South and how that remains an issue. And how did Roy play a part in terms of your own awakening to that and comfort with that, and within a community that's not always welcome to that? And
I don't think any of
also,
the books we read in that class directly applied to what I was trying to do. They were just various kinds of nonfiction.
Mhm.
But my time at Columbia in general did help me a lot because when I got there, basically I knew how to interview people and how to sit in a room and write down what people do. But I didn't know how to do all the other stuff that's around that like imbues context and explains how did we get, I didn't know how to explain like how what's happening right now is generally rooted in like 100 years of history. And so Columbia has just an insane library. You can get any book that ever existed, even ones that weren't published. And so I just started reading tons about the South. And I remember one book that I read that really helped me start to think about this differently is one of my professor's books. Nick Lemon wrote a book about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to Chicago. And it opens up with this scene where all of the tractors are like rolling into this farm in Mississippi to put all of the sharecroppers out of business. And my grandmother had talked to me because my grandmother was a sharecropper, and she had talked to me about how they got forced off the farm and how depressing it was. But I never thought like, oh, you're telling me about a significant moment in history. I was just like, okay, so what? You didn't live on the farm anymore. But as I read his book, I realized like, oh no, this was a huge shift in American history where tens of thousands of laborers suddenly lost their jobs to tractors, and it reshaped the American South, reshaped Chicago. And once I read that book, I started to think, okay, like, well, what else in my family's life is part of this American discourse? And so from there, I think, like, I took a history on I took the history of American poverty at Columbia and just started taking more classes like that to try to figure out, like, how do I fill things in? Like, another big thing that is in the book is religion. And when I grew up, we were like an offshoot of Pentecostalism. And my mom talked about every other denomination as if it were a cult. Like, for her, Catholics were as good as demons. And so I was like, well, let me look into our religion a little bit. And it turns out it wasn't even invented till like 1900. Like, just some guy in Kansas made up our religion, and then it just spread. And I had no idea, like, this thing that I had tortured myself with. I mean, the Bible pre-exists him, of course, but like this version that I grew up with was pretty young. And so I tried to use Columbia's library to just get like tons of books on the history of Pentecostalism or cotton and fill in all of the stuff that I had done in my documentary work of just talking to people.
Was that what did you do that kind of as your own research for yourself? And I think as part of this shift from seeing writing as something, as part of journalism, where it's all about deadlines and quick turnaround for a story, to then writing these larger stories that fall into history. Was that something you did for yourself? Was that also part of a class? It seemed like in the book to me that you were taking it on for yourself to kind of find this context and this deeper connection to a larger set of stories that are more than just your own and Roy's.
Yeah, none of that reading was for class. I mean, the book proposal was for class. Mm-hmm. So that was nice to get to do that as part of your graduation. But no, a lot of it was just, it's interesting when you go to a program like that, you just like turn off your regular life and just work the entire time. I know Ryan is in a program right now, and it's just like you enter this whole other phase where you're just like, I exist to create and work and read, and it's not many times in life that you get that opportunity. And I'm grateful Columbia had really good scholarships. And I saw another person who gave me a scholarship to Columbia is on here. So thank you to Jan and the McCormick Foundation. Um, it really was just like I lived right next to the library. And so at night I would just go over there and like thumb through the cotton books. And but you mentioned like writing longer versus newspaper stuff. I try to think of each chapter in the book almost as like its own article. So,
Mhm.
there'll be one that's kind of the theme of it is religion. And so I would try to think of it with like a beginning, middle, and end and think, okay, well, here's all the research I'm going to do about this. And like, it's technically a chapter about my mom, but it's also about evangelicalism. And so I would just kind of use the same process I would for writing a newspaper article where one of the things that I don't think anyone tells you about for books is that you have to transcribe every interview you do. So I transcribed all of those 8 terabytes myself. My transcription file is like 700 pages. And this is pre like Trent and stuff where things will transcribe for you. So I just sat there listening to video, rewinding, transcribing. So for each chapter, I would like transcribe all the interviews, put in, read all my cotton books, type up my notes from that, make an outline, draw an outline, and just the same process that I use for writing an article, essentially.
Yeah. What did you, that experience of transcription? I know it's a crazy one. And I did an oral history class in graduate school where I had to transcribe and sit with these tapes of all these people I knew growing up and hearing their voices and listening to their stories again and again. And what was that like for you too? What did you get out of it that you didn't expect? Like what that kind of more granular work that you were doing? Is there
Out of the transcription?
Yeah, out of just I mean, just like living with those tapes. I mean, I think it gives you in the same way that you didn't initially see yourself as part of the story. Was there anything unexpected that came out of that experience of going through those transcriptions again? Because you were there for the initial interview, but having it again from home in that kind of more intimate space, did anything else come up that you realized that helped you either ask different questions down the line or just reshape the project?
Yeah, I love taping things and listening to them later because in any kind of long project, even if it's a newspaper project, you will hit a wall at some point where you think, why did I ever think this is interesting? I hate this story. I never wanted to do it. And reading your notes does not get you back there. It just does not reignite your passion. But for me, always, always, always going back and listening to the tape and listening to the people always makes me feel like, oh, right, I found this person fascinating at some point. They're still fascinating. It's me who's the problem. Let me get myself back together. And so I think the tapes do that. But the other big thing is that because I envisioned this in such a narrow manner where I was going to do a documentary about Roy,
Mhm.
I did transcribe everything, but I wasn't thinking about what happened in between. I never really was, sometimes I would take shortcuts in my transcription in the early days where I would type Casey talking to mom for a long time here.
Mhm.
Because I was like, I don't want to transcribe this. This isn't part of the story. But then when I like change it to a book and my mother becomes a major figure, then I had to go back to all of that stuff and be like, okay, well, what was Casey talking to mom about? And
Mhm.
so at that point, my mom had died. And so it took on a whole different meaning for me because in all of these tapes, my mom was still alive. And I could just go back and kind of like sit with her for a long time and watch her and rewind her and be like, when I was like 26, she went on a couple of the trips with me. And at the time when she'd talk to me, I'd be like, okay, like we're not here to talk about you. Like get with the program. We're here to talk about Roy. But then, when I went back to it at 36, I just would like sit in those moments for a long time and be like, okay, 26-year-old Casey, hush and let your mom talk. And I could just start to see that all of those in between moments were like a part of the story, like all of the dinners that we had or the other things that I thought were off topic were actually all connected and at the heart of it. And it was really hard to write the last few chapters in this because I knew that once I did, I had to turn all my videotapes off and I was kind of attached to living in that world where they were all still alive. I mean, I wrote this in 2020 largely,
Mhm.
and I, we were all stuck inside and living online, and in a way, like watching videotapes of my mom wasn't any different than what anyone else was doing with their mom in that year.
Yeah.
And knowing that I'm going to turn this hard drive off and I'm not coming back to it was just painful. Like I had to start therapy just to finish the last two chapters. I had never gone before, but I couldn't do the last two chapters. So,
How did you get through it? So, I mean, that's another thing is this, that's what I think is so interesting about this book is that so much of the heart of the book is in the digressions and is in those moments where, and I could see it in the book too, where your mom, you were saying to yourself, why does she want to go visit these people and talk about her ex-boyfriend and talk to this person in the cemetery? We've got to get back to the topic. We got to go find Roy. We've got to find the people who know him. And it's always about what you find in the margins, right? But how was that for you in the end? I mean, in terms of putting it together and like letting it go.
well, the putting it together,
Well, I mean,
I
in
think,
terms of the final chapters, right? So
oh, the
that,
final one.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, so it took me probably 6 months to write the first two chapters, and maybe even a year to write the first two chapters, and then about 6 to 7 months to write the middle 20 chapters, and then again like another 6 months to write the final three because I just couldn't do it. And like, um, sorry for the spoilers here, but the third to last chapter is when my mom dies, and I just couldn't do it. I finally forced myself to write something, but I couldn't reread it. Like normally when I do a chapter, I will reread it out loud about 20 times. I'll go around, just thinking about it. I couldn't reread it even once. It was so painful to write. And my sweet editor, bless her, she read it and she was like, kind of tiptoed toward me, like, I don't want to, make you feel weird. And it's really hard to edit someone writing about their dead mom, but like, I think you need to go back to it. She was really gentle with me. And I
Yeah.
was just like, no, I don't want to go back to that. But eventually I,
Did you talk it out
amazingly,
together with your editor? Did that help?
no, we didn't really talk about it that much. Again, it was like the pandemic and she was, trying to do the virtual schooling with her kid. And it was kind of a hard time to do a book, but I got this therapist who I think is probably the most angelic person on earth. She strangely was like a friend of mine recommended her, but she was a lesbian in Kentucky. And initially she thought she could see me because everything was virtual, but then it turned out you have to be licensed in the state where you live. And
Right.
so she called me and she was like, I can't actually see you. And I just started crying so hard. She's like, well, I'll talk to you today for free. And then like, I'll help you find someone else. And then at the end of it, she was like, no, I think I can help you. So I'm just going to do this for free and I won't bill you. And she gave me free therapy for 6 months. And she was just such a huge help in helping me to understand why I couldn't write them and just talking me through. I mean, I really do owe that woman a lot because it was very painful to write them. And even now, like when I had to do the audiobook, I just was like on edge as we got to that chapter. I was like, I don't want to say these words out loud.
No.
Um, I don't think I'll ever read them again, honestly. But I did it somehow. They're done. Other people can read them.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's one of those things too, where someone, yeah, losing that person, but in a way, I don't know, I'm trying to think of ways to connect it to your experience of trying to find Roy. And it's not the same at all, but I think that there's this searching for someone to not, and I think the book really does a great job of avoiding putting people on pedestals and turning them into myths. It would have been very easy to do that. But instead, you keep going. And I think that's part of the fact that you've been doing so many transcriptions and interviews. You go back to the person themselves, back to their stories, back to their circumstances to kind of flesh out this idea of someone who's very real. And I don't know,
I was telling people at one of the readings I did here the other day that probably my favorite thing that I learned in the whole process was someone told me that Roy would get really angry if he lost at dominoes and he would throw all the dominoes out the window and storm out. And I just love that because everyone else had talked about him as if he were just like precious, just because he was possibly trans. He was just angel perfect.
Mhm.
Um, and that's not how real people are. Marginalized, I mean, this is one of the worst things in journalism. I think people write about marginalized communities of all sorts as if they are just completely pure people that, have no agency. And to me, like, that's just as disrespectful as being, I mean, maybe not as disrespectful as being bigoted, but it is. It just doesn't see them as real humans. And for me, just that little bit of information of seeing, like, no, like, this was a dude who hated to lose at dominoes. Like, I really relate to that. I hate losing at dominoes. And it just made him like real to me in a way that other things hadn't. And I think it goes to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like what we're facing now in terms of, abortion laws and you can't be and having like a perfect that you're either, and especially in sexual abuse cases or sexual assault cases, that it's an impossible case unless you're a perfect victim, and no one is perfect, and people should be allowed to be flawed. And that's just what we need to learn to see a more well-rounded idea of who people are. And I think even if you're, and I think what's interesting to me, I kept going back to thinking about what it must have been like for people in the 50s and in terms of how they interacted with Roy, and how without certain language around the idea of queerness that they could talk about it and be maybe not necessarily comfortable, but because Roy was someone who was a part of their community, they could feel at ease talking about him and to him. I'm losing my train
Well,
of
I
thought.
think the
You know what I mean?
community
Like a whole
kind of
person,
did.
yeah. And how
Yeah,
that
I think the
evolution takes place.
community kind of did what you're saying as well, where they, I mean, Roy existed in a very different time. There was no Heritage Foundation, no Alliance Defending Freedom, like setting up lawsuits across the country.
Mhm.
And so his existence was not politicized in the same way. And that allowed people to like make up negotiations for why he existed that way. And so only one person I ever interviewed down there was like, I think he was transgender. Everyone else is like, well, a piece of farm equipment fell on her head and that's why it happened. Like she stopped getting her period and that's how this happened. And someone else was like, well, her family was too poor to afford starch for dresses. And I was like, so this person lived for 80 years as a man because his family couldn't afford starch? Like,
Yeah,
and at, some point starch went out of style. That's separate note, but
sure.
I do think people thought of him as a victim, as either a kidnapping victim or a poverty victim or a farm equipment victim.
Injured, yes.
Yeah, so I do think, yeah, I think journalism really does over prioritize those neat narratives, and that's something I had to unlearn. I mean, it's hard because it's easier to sell to your bosses, it's easier to sell to readers, and then it's easy to just like keep regurgitating what you've read in other things. And if it goes against that, it's hard to. I know I was talking about my Columbia program earlier, and I kind of the nexus of that program is you write one magazine piece, and I was writing one, and the family was really poor, but they lived in like a regular neighborhood and like a little ranch house that was quiet. And in my first draft, like I didn't describe the house at all. And one of my favorite journalists had read a copy, and she was like, "Well, why didn't you describe where they live?" And I was like, "Oh, it would mess up the story because where they live doesn't look poor." And she was just like, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." Like, like that she's like basically said the mess is the story, and
Mhm.
you have to paint people in all their fullness, and it's not up to you to just regurgitate stereotypes that readers have. Like real poverty doesn't always look like shanty apartments. And so I take that in all of the work that I do now. I still, my gut instinct a lot of times is to just like neaten everything up, but I'm trying.
It's really, yeah, it's all too easy to try to make the story fit the narrative that you want to create. And I think this book dispels that completely. I wanted to ask you about, I mean, I think another thing about this idea of kind of seeing the whole person, I don't know, and this is kind of a leap, but I was thinking also about how much the book has to deal with religion and then its absence. Do you feel like in some way the work of this book was also kind of a work of faith that you had to keep continuing to go back and look through and try to find different people. How did that, was something that was present for you as well? Just that kind of act.
I never thought of it.
Really?
That way. I mean, I do think journalism took the role that church had played in my life, just in general, not with this book, but
Mommy. Sorry, everyone. We were talking about cats interrupting, and now it's children. My apologies, everyone.
my whole bag of treats worked, it seems like. My cat's being quiet. But yeah, in the years after I first got kicked out of church, I didn't know what to do on Sunday mornings, and I would like wake up and just feel wrong. Or, I was in college, so I might have woken up hungover, but even still, I'd be like, oh, this isn't what I'm supposed to be doing. And it wasn't until I got like my first newspaper job and like my first subscription to the Sunday New York Times that I started to be like, well, this is my church. Like I wake up on Sunday and I read Modern Love, um and my community, when I was growing up, all my community was mostly from church, and now I would say like more of my community is from newsrooms or people I've worked with. And I guess it's like the place. I think the thing that I really loved about church, though I believed in God as a young person, what I loved about church is the way that I fit with all the people there, and the way that they seemed to be, the way they seemed to love me, the way they were stable forces in my life. I mean, we moved a lot, and to just have these people that are going to be there every Sunday and Wednesday. I mean, I wish I had that now, where there's just people I see every Sunday and Wednesday. Um, I I just do better with that kind of stability, and I guess journalism does that for me in a way.
Yeah, I think that I think, there's so much written about the void of like losing the bowling league or losing the union hall or things like that in different communities, and how we kind of find that again is really complicated. And I think also,
I have seen like 7 articles in the last 2 weeks about how pickleball is going to be that. I still
oh
don't understand
God,
what pickleball is, but everyone is writing about it as the the
it's
cure
the
for America.
yeah, it's the panacea. Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah, I think. But in terms of going back to this idea of faith, like you could have just never gone back home again and had this great life, but you kept going back, and so I think that too is another way of like returning to that sense of community, despite the challenges that it faced, and in terms of how you could create that through line with your family through this project.
Can you have a great life if you have an open wound, though?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the question, right?
I don't think I could. I don't think one of my other best friends slash mentors is on here, and she said to me at some point while I was writing this, like, I think you're gonna have the life that you deserve after you write this book. And I don't think she just meant like financially or career wise. I think she was like, you're processing a lot of things that you didn't want to process in your life, and it held me back. I didn't tell my spouse a lot of the things that were in this book. I didn't tell my best friends, and it was only through the process of writing it that I was able. I mean, a lot of this book is about my mom as an opioid addict, and I never told anyone that until, oddly, I told the person that I mentioned is my mentor from Columbia. For some reason, I told her like right when I met her, but before that I had never told anyone, and now I just told whoever's going to buy the book. But I think, yeah, it allowed me to just have a reason to go back home and like look some of these things in the face and say like, okay, you've got a good job, you have friends, you got out of this place, but like what hold does it still have on you, and like what do you need to reckon with to move forward?
Yeah. How has the South changed for you? I mean, you aren't living there now, and I mean, I understand that as someone else who also can't move back in a lot of ways to where she grew up. Louisiana is a complicated place, but how often do you get back now, and what is it for you?
I go back a couple of times a year. I've already been to Mississippi twice this year, and I've been to Louisiana once. Um, It's very strongly two very different things. I mean, on one hand, it just like as soon as I get out of the airport at Louis Armstrong, like the air smells right. Like I usually like get my rental car and like blast country music and like bomb down the street and like go right to the shrimp shack. And all of that stuff feels so good. Like the way the air feels, like my hair is curlier in the right way when I'm down there. And, people I love and have loved for a long time are down there. But then I also just like find myself retreating. Like I don't want to tell people about myself or tell them that I'm gay. And even on like elevators, sometimes I get nervous. And there's also just like practical things like New Orleans, for instance, doesn't recycle. And it's now painful to me after living in Portland for so long to throw a plastic bottle in the trash can. And I I don't know how to like square the two feelings of like this is my place and it also isn't my place. But like I just went to Mississippi a couple weeks ago and like the first day I was there, I was like, I'm home. I love this place. Like I love all these people. I love the way everyone says hi to you.
Mhm.
And then nobody wore masks at this event that I was at. There's just, thousands of people without masks and a couple of weird looks. And like the people at the airport were kind of weird to me. And then, like, by the time I was on my last flight back to Portland, there were like everyone just like dressed more like me. And there were two Black Trans Lives Matter t shirts on and get on the plane. And I was like, oh, I'm home. Like, as I was going to Portland, where I was just like, I'm going back to the place that I fit in. Someone has just chatted that they do recycle in New Orleans.
Yeah.
If I guess maybe my friends just don't recycle when I go down there. So I'm sorry if I have sent out negative information. Oh, someone
The
says
thing
if it gets picked up.
if it gets
Okay,
picked
well,
up.
so
And there
we're
is a
iffy
whole
on whether or
plan
not
through, I mean,
Orleans is
that's
safe.
a whole other conversation is through Tulane. There is an organization that is trying to do something with the glass and turn it into sand to help with the wetlands. So there's that
Oh,
too.
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just also like the infrastructure. Like when I was in
Oh
New
yeah.
Orleans this last time, like every one of my friends has a blue tarp on their roof from the hurricane last year. And they still don't have, they just can't get their roofs fixed. I mean, if you're paying attention to Jackson, Mississippi right now, they have a water system failure. Like when I was there for the book reading, there was no water available. They were just like handing out bottled water everywhere. Like they're to the point where the universities have closed because kids can't take showers. And the journalist part of me is like, I got to go down there. But the human part of me is like, wow, it feels good to be in a city that works.
It's hard. How do you reconcile that through your work? Do you feel like it makes you look for more stories and try to pitch those stories and do that work, or?
Oh yeah, I'm always trying to get editors to send me down there. I love going there. I just like
Yeah.
coming back, recharging here. But yeah, I mean, if you look at my stories, it's like a far more southern stories than there maybe should be for my national beat. But for some reason, well, not for some reason, I've been to Texas 3 times this year, and I was going to say for some reason, but I think
Right.
Texas is that reason that I have been there so much because they just happen to overlap with my beat because they're, restricted abortion. They were arresting parents for letting their kids transition. And so, I go where the news is. And
Yeah.
a lot of times the news is in the South.
Do you feel like you have another book in you right now? Or are you thinking about it? No.
No,
Did you
I'm going to
enjoy
do
the
my,
process? Do you want
I'm
to do it
gonna,
again?
oh, I like the process. I'm just enjoying my day job right now.
Mhm.
Um, I don't have something that, I talked about this book writing class at Columbia, and like on the first day, the the professor gives you this spiel that is like if you think you can do anything else at all, do it. Like you have to want to write a book more than anything in the world because it's painful, it's lonely, it doesn't pay a lot. Um, it takes longer than you think it's going to take. It's extremely vulnerable. So if there's anything else in the world you think you could spend your time doing and be happier than writing a book, like go do that. And I
Mhm.
knew for me, like this story, like it doesn't matter if anyone's going to pay me. It doesn't matter if anyone's going to read it. Like I have to do it for reasons I can't explain. And I think, that's shown by me continuing to do it for so long, but I don't have that feeling about another story right now. Like maybe that one will develop as I do my regular day job, but um one thing I like about journalism is just like being a part of a community and like becoming an expert at something. And so I'm enjoying getting to do that right now. Like I'm about to go to Iowa to write about this trans teenager who also got kicked out of his church, but
Mhm.
was just kind of like, no, I don't agree with you. Like God loves trans people. And so he writes like 10 letters to kids a week who might be struggling with their faith and are queer or trans. And he runs like a Bible study for trans kids. And like, I'm just like gonna go enjoy this teenager and like be happy for a little bit and not have my whole life wrapped up in it.
Right. Or be working. How do you feel about that open room?
It's a little less open, I guess. There's always probably like things that will feel that way, but I would say the one thing that I really got out of this book, other than all the notoriety and claim and riches, is I became a lot closer to my family. Like I had really convinced myself that everyone in my family hated me or judged me, and that was really me. Like most of them actually wanted to know and love me, even if we have different ideas about some things. And they all, I like multiple aunts wrote me today to tell me they had bought it and already, there were some of them that had already finished it. And it just, I was not expecting my aunts to read it. Multiple cousins worked on this with me.
Right.
And it was just like fun to like have my cousins on the road with me and like not just be talking about Roy, but be talking about our lives and like get to know each other. And like, it was just a decade where I like developed this closeness with them. So I think that wound has been healed. I was gonna say sealed over.
No, I understand.
I'm not a medical person, but so there are some things like that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I keep thinking too about, in terms of what gets uncovered when you're actually talking to someone and the different stories, especially surrounding like Roy. I mean, a lot of it in the books revolves around Roy's kind of origin and how Roy came to be this person, and everyone has different stories. But I think that also is something about families too, is that everyone has a different perspective and a different take on the same story. And so yeah, this book, I think, really confronts that idea of memory as well, like how reliable it is and how we choose to believe what we need to believe at a certain time and how that shifts throughout the course of things.
Having all the tape made that an interesting experience. I mean, I tried to go back and report about myself the way I would someone else. So I reread all my journals, I watched all the tape, I looked at like emails I sent my best friend in college. We used to where we had like a shared blog, and I went looking through that. But sometimes I would find I was just wrong about things. Like, for instance, this professor I mentioned, he wanted me to include my mom in it. And initially I was like, no, my mom wasn't a part of this. And then I was looking at videotape from one of the trips, unrelated. And then I suddenly heard my mom talking in the background. And I like started frantically like opening clips. I was like, wait, is my mother here with me? And she totally was on this entire trip. And I just like blocked her out of my mind. Probably because it was painful to think about her. But um, yeah, memory is crazy. Even when you think like I'm going to be as honest as I can.
Yeah, it's hard. I know we're if do people have questions, please type them into the chat. We have a little bit of time left. I'd love to answer some questions.
Oh, yeah. Philip. All right. Let's see. Phil, if you want to, I can unmute you really quickly if you prefer to speak. Yeah. Let me.
Oh, are you holding the book?
Hey, I am. It arrived yesterday, so I haven't read it yet, but I'm super excited to dive into this. And just congratulations. I mean, I'm so proud of you. And it sounds like such an exciting story, and obviously a labor of love. And one of the questions I have, and perhaps you get into this in the book, but I'm sort of curious as it relates to your grandmother. Is she still living? And how does she feel about reading this book now, about this person that she sort of introduced you to? I don't know if that's giving anything away or if you touch on that in the book, but that was something I was curious about based on what you said.
Yeah, sadly, my grandmother died in 2016. And I will say, like, when I got to the end of reporting it, it was very hard to not be able to tell her like all of the things I found. But before she died, I did get a bunch of young pictures of Roy, and I was able to take them to show her. And I think that was probably the main thing that she actually wanted, because she just didn't have a picture of him. And like when I brought the pictures to her, they're pictures of him at like 18. And she just got this look in her eye that was kind of like, oh yeah, this is the guy. And she was like, look at how handsome he is. And I was like, oh, do you have a crush on him? Like, I never got up the courage to ask her because I think I was afraid if I asked her, she would get offended or like ruin like my dream that she had a crush on him. But I was happy that I could at least like return him to her in a little bit. And I also got Roy kept a lot of notes in his Bible, and somebody actually had his old Bible, and the I was able to take like some of his notes from his Bible to my grandmother. And they were, I mean, like one of the notes was in there was about how when you get to heaven, you get a new body, and you he had written under it like we shall be free. And so I was able to take some of those things to her, and I think answered some of her questions.
I had a question, if that's okay. I know I'm a part of I'm just a bookseller, but I had a question. One of my favorite novels is by a trans author also named Casey Plett. That's a Little Fish, and it's about this person coming to terms with the fact that their grandfather may or may not have been trans. And I just became so interested in, like, when I was reading this book, I started thinking about other Casey's book, and just the concept of like archival grief and like reckoning without language and identities for something in the South. And how do you reckon, as both a memoirist and a journalist, with archival grief, or the lack of certain texts and the lack of certain labels for things?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think that is definitely one of the hardest parts is like, well, these were all like working class to poor people who did not live documented lives, and trying to like wrest that from nothing was just so painful. And like going back and like looking at things, looking at the newspapers and seeing they weren't in there. Um, and just not, one thing I really wrestled with is knowing how Roy identifies. I never got to ask him. I decided for myself to use he pronouns because I felt like he woke up every morning and dressed himself in men's clothes, and he got his hair cut that way. And I'm gonna honor that effort with this pronoun, but I might be wrong. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think he had the word trans. It's interesting. I did go back and look at other newspapers. I looked at his local newspaper to see, like, for instance, like in the 80s, Billy Tipton, who was a jazz singer, died, and when the authorities like went to his house, they like saw that he had what they would consider a female anatomy, and like all of the newspapers, even the ones that went to Delhi, would say like he lived a lie. And like just looking at like, okay, what did the newspaper that came to Roy's house, how did they describe people who were living similarly to him, and like what would that have felt like for him to read those? Even like Christine Jorgensen, or just other people whose lives, I guess, were more documented. But ultimately, like, I don't know. And like, and even, I got a lot of younger pictures of my grandmother, and she's, as a young person, quite handsome in a way that some might describe as gay face. And I don't know. I mean, I don't, she never identified as gay. Probably if I asked her, she would have said no. But there's a part of me that looks at that and I'm like, were you? Or, if this were a different time, would things have been different? Or I don't know. There's just, yeah, there's things that you can't know, or things that I may be anachronistically putting on people. I
But that's
think,
not a bad I mean, again, yeah, I don't want to it's not a I was just curious about that, because for
what is
me, like,
the other
oops, sorry.
what's the other book called?
Oh, Little Fish by Casey Plett,
Oh, I'll
because
have to
that's
look it
something
up.
that's a theme that I was reading your book, and I feel like you handled it so well. And so, like, part of the story for me when I was reading so far was like the lack of the fact that you couldn't have this interview with Roy was such a big character in this story, was that you're like, and this sort of grief that your grandmother told you about this and you never got down to it. So I don't know. I was curious. Thank you for answering that.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. Like I got really overly attached to any ephemera. Like at some point I got a subscription to something called newspapers.com, and they've digitized all small town newspapers. And so I searched for his name in there and I found all these classified ads where he was selling dogs or music equipment. So I could see like which reel to reel did he have, which guitar did he have, and like even all of that stuff. I was just like, there's some record that he exists. You know, I mean, for a long time, my grandmother would tell me about him, but you couldn't Google him. And so the only way to do it was to go to this town. And I remember the first time someone showed me a picture, or the first time someone said, yes, I know him, was just this huge relief of like, okay, he's real. Now what?
Yeah.
We have time for one more question if anyone has it. Oh, amazing. Mary has a question. Mary said, it's such a huge responsibility to write about someone's life. How did you get to the point where you felt like you'd done Roy justice?
Well, I don't know if I can do that without spoilers. How to answer this? Well, it's hard to ever do anyone justice, even when you have their consent and you've spent a ton of time with them. There's always things you have to leave out, either because of space or because of the way narrative arcs go. But at some point, something happened, and if you want to know, you have to order the book from McNally. That made me feel like it was okay to do the book. And that's something I wrestled with for a long time too. Just like, is it okay to do this? Like, would he be mad? A lot of people described him as a private person. And so I'm like, is this wrong for me to do this? So that just took me years even of that figuring out. And but eventually something happened that made me feel like, no, Roy would want this. And so I'm gonna move forward as best I can.
Well, I think you handle it so well with the ambiguity. And I think that there are so many different ways that you could have worked it. And I felt like you really towed a beautiful line in terms of giving Roy the dignity that he deserved. And I think that that would have been, I don't know, I wanted to say that. I read a book this summer too that also dealt with queerness and trans issues, that also was, it's called Trumpet by Jackie Kay, the Scottish playwright and poet novelist, that is inspired by Billy Tipton's life. And it's all about figuring out and coming to terms with the fact that this person was not who anyone assumed they were until later in life, and having to grieve and try to reconstruct who they were and what their wishes would be and what their kind of hopes would be about themselves and how they want to be remembered, and how their legacy should be held on to after their death. And I think that's a lot of what this book also, you know, captures, is kind of like, what is our legacy? Any of us, not just Roy, and it poses it to all of us. And I think that's really one universal element of this book too. So
interesting. I mean, Billy Tipton seems to have been able to live as a man without anyone questioning that. And in Delhi, everyone knew about Roy, and I think that was pretty painful for him. In part because people would act on it, like he would try to go to churches and they would kick him out for not wearing the dress. And
right.
I'll have to look that up. Thanks for all the queer lit suggestions.
Sorry, there's like a queer book club now. We're doing this.
Yeah, everyone come back next Wednesday for
exactly. We'll have our Wednesday book club, and that's
that'll be my church.
I love that. That would be so good for me. I've been thinking about starting it. And I bet I was going to say, my last question was that this American Life ever come back to you kicking themselves for like, oh man, this was a great story. We should have gotten it when we had the chance.
No, I'm sure it went to like a slush pile or something.
No blurb from Ira Glass.
Yeah, Ira Glass, not
Missing,
like, he'll write a review.
I should go back and try to find my original thing that I recorded. I mean, I was recording it with like an Olympus like from Office Depot, you know. Well, and then
Oh.
I read like what recorder This American Life used, and I bought it. It was like $700, and then I did not know how to use it at all. And like my first interviews, like I'm in the video footage holding this expensive equipment that I just had no idea what I was doing with. So I'm sure they had good reasons to turn me down. I became, you know, I got better at it over the years. I don't think I had it fully thought out back then, but we do still have the footage. So if anyone has any podcast hookups or anything, like I would still love to make something with it, because almost everyone in the book has passed away, and it's not, I have release forms for them, but it would be nice to preserve like their actual way of speaking, because even if you're a good writer, you can just never capture people in their true essence.
Mm. Well, thank you so much. And I look forward to the podcast in the future that has these recordings, because I mean that was one of my favorite parts of the book, was hearing like seeing this thing start off as this dream for This American Life and turn into something that was a lot more proliferated into this huge and amazing memoir. So thank you. And thank you, Lauren, for asking these amazing questions. That was so nice.
My hope for the paperback is that there's maybe some of the diary and images
know.
in the book too. So
Put pressure on the
yeah.
publisher. But thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Casey. And yeah, thank you for have a good rest of your afternoon or night.
Thank you.
Wherever you are.
Everybody buy the book.
Yes, buy the book. Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
Thank you
Take
so
care,
much.
y'all.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.